I had been in my profession for years, caring for people during their most vulnerable moments, but nothing in my career prepared me for the day I first met Daniel. He was sitting in a wheelchair when I entered his home, his gaze steady but softened by a faint, almost disarming smile. Something about his eyes caught me. There was a mixture of strength and loneliness that lingered there. I told myself it was just empathy, part of the job, but the truth is, a small current of curiosity ran through me that I couldn't quite explain. I had a stable life outside of work, at least that's what I told myself. My partner and I had been together for years, and while we were committed, the warmth that once filled our home had thinned into something colder, quieter. We didn't fight. We just stopped reaching for each other. I never sought out more than what I had, but deep down, I had been craving connection without even realizing it. Daniel's case was straightforward. A sports injury had left him temporarily unable to walk, and my role was to assist with his recovery. Yet, almost from the start, there was something different in the air. He was quick-witted, always ready with a comment that pulled a reluctant smile from me. Even on days when I was tired or distracted, his presence seemed to pull me into the moment. It felt harmless. After all, I had worked with plenty of patients before, but I found myself looking forward to our sessions more than I should have. He talked about his life freely, not in the rehearsed way some people do, but with a kind of openness that felt rare. He spoke of his career, his friends, and the nights he stayed up too late watching old films. He asked questions about me, not just surface-level pleasantries, but the kind that made me think about the answers. I found myself sharing bits of my life, things I usually kept private. The books I loved, the meals I cooked when I couldn't sleep, the music I listened to when I needed to escape. There was a moment, early on, when I adjusted the brace on his leg and my hand brushed his. It was nothing, really, but I remember how he didn't move away immediately, and how my own fingers lingered for half a second too long. I laughed it off, and so did he, but that tiny spark was undeniable. From then on, I became more aware of how close we stood, how his voice dropped slightly when we spoke in quiet rooms, how his eyes seemed to search mine for something unspoken. I told myself it was nothing. Just a patient. Just part of the job. But each day, a little voice inside me whispered otherwise. I didn't know it then, but that quiet whisper would soon turn into something impossible to ignore, pulling me toward a choice I never thought I'd make. The days began to blend together, yet each visit to Daniel felt distinct, almost charged in a way I couldn't fully admit to myself. Our conversations became less about his recovery and more about the fragments of life that had shaped us. He told me about growing up in a small coastal town, about the salt in the air and the sound of waves that still lulled him to sleep in memory. I told him about the city, about nights spent on balconies under neon skies, about the way I used to believe love was enough to fix anything. There was no sudden leap, just a slow, steady drift into something deeper. The space between us seemed to shrink with every word shared, every laugh exchanged. Sometimes, we'd sit in silence, but it was never empty. His presence filled the room in a way that made me feel seen, not just looked at. That kind of attention is dangerous when you've been starving for it. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult session, Daniel admitted how lonely he felt. He spoke of his marriage as though it were an old photograph, faded, tucked away, untouched for years. His wife was often away, caught up in her own world, and though they lived under the same roof, he said they had stopped living in the same life. His voice was steady as he spoke, but his eyes carried the weight of someone who had long accepted that nothing would change. Something shifted in me then. I wasn't supposed to blur that line, wasn't supposed to relate to him in a way that tethered my own marriage to his words, but I did. I confessed that my relationship had its own quiet fractures, the kind no one noticed until they became wide enough to fall into. We both laughed at the strange comfort in realizing how parallel our situations were, but the laughter didn't erase the truth. The more we opened up, the more I began to feel like we were confiding in each other in ways we hadn't with anyone else. There was no judgment, no need to pretend. We shared stories about sleepless nights, about the moments when life felt unbearably still, about the ache of wanting something you can't name. One evening, as I was leaving, Daniel's hand brushed mine again. Accidental, perhaps, but deliberate in the way neither of us moved away immediately. Our eyes met, and in that quiet exchange, there was an unspoken acknowledgement. We were standing on the edge of something we shouldn't cross. And yet, neither of us stepped back. It was a grey afternoon, the kind where the sky feels heavy and the air hums with stillness. I had come for my usual visit, carrying the same bag, wearing the same neutral smile, but something in Daniel's demeanour was different. He seemed quieter, more withdrawn, as though the words he wanted to say were caught somewhere between his chest and his throat. I asked if he was in pain, but he shook his head slowly, his gaze fixed on mine in a way that made the room feel smaller. We began with his exercises, but halfway through, he stopped and let out a breath that sounded almost like surrender. "I don't think I can keep doing this," he said softly, though I wasn't sure if he meant the therapy or something else entirely. I placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, telling him that progress takes time. His hand lifted, covering mine, warm and steady. Neither of us moved. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. His eyes searched mine, and in that moment, every careful boundary I had built felt thin and fragile. He said my name, not like a patient addressing a caregiver, but like someone saying it because they needed to. And then, without warning, the space between us vanished. It wasn't dramatic, no cinematic sweep, just the quiet press of his lips against mine. For a second, I froze, my mind screaming about rules, vows, the people who trusted us. But then there was the rush, of heat, of connection, of feeling wanted in a way I hadn't in years. It was over in moments, but those moments felt suspended, like the world had stopped spinning just for us. When we pulled apart, I couldn't meet his eyes. My hands trembled slightly, and I stepped back, my pulse pounding so loudly it drowned out the rain tapping against the window. Daniel didn't apologize, and I didn't, either. There was only the weight of what had just happened, thick between us. I told myself it was a mistake, a lapse in judgment, something we could bury beneath professionalism and silence. But as I gathered my things, my fingers brushed against his once more, and instead of pulling away, we both lingered, just enough to feel that spark again. In my head, I knew this was the point of no return. One small, quiet moment had shifted everything, and no matter how much I tried to convince myself otherwise, we had crossed a line we couldn't uncross. The days that followed were nothing like before. The air between us carried a weight we both felt but didn't dare name. I arrived for my visits on time, performed every task with precision, yet every glance, every touch, carried the memory of what had happened. It was as if the room itself remembered. Daniel was different too, warmer in some ways, more guarded in others. He spoke less about his recovery and more about things that didn't matter on paper but meant everything in the moment. Sometimes his words would drift toward the future, as if imagining a life beyond his injury, beyond the walls of that house, beyond the people we were tied to. I never encouraged it, but I didn't stop him either. Guilt became a constant hum inside me. At night, I'd lie beside my partner, pretending to sleep, while my mind replayed every detail of that kiss. It wasn't just the physical act, it was the hunger it revealed in both of us. The realization that, for all the ways I thought I was holding my life together, I had already let go in places that mattered most. One visit, I told Daniel we needed to talk. He nodded, as if he had been expecting it. I said we couldn't continue whatever this was, that it would destroy too much. He listened quietly, his hands folded in his lap. When I finished, he simply said, "I know." There was no anger, no pleading, just resignation, like someone watching the tide take something they loved out to sea. Ending it didn't erase what had happened. The moments we shared stayed with me, not in the loud, dramatic way of a scandal, but in the quiet ache of knowing a part of me had been altered. I still saw him for a time, purely in a professional sense, but every visit carried an unspoken awareness that neither of us could forget. Eventually, his recovery reached a point where my care was no longer needed. Our final meeting was brief, just a polite exchange, a handshake that lingered a fraction too long, and then I walked away. I didn't look back, though every step felt heavier than the last. I returned to my life, my routines, the version of myself I was before Daniel. But in truth, that version was gone. I had helped my patient, given him care and support when he needed it most. Yet somewhere along the way, I had crossed a line that left me with a truth I would carry quietly for the rest of my life. Sometimes the deepest wounds aren't the ones we can see, and sometimes the person you help is the one who changes you forever.